For example 3, I need to fill in the table of values and then plot those points to make the graph for exponential function. So the three numbers that we always use, no matter what, is -1, 0, and 1. And we use this because it is the center of the graph, and that's what we want. We want it to be right here in the middle of the graph. We don't want to be way over here or way over here. Got to be in the center. So I take these three numbers and I plug it in to this expression. Again, that f of x is y. Okay, so for -1, I have y equals 3 times 2 to the -1. I can't have a negative, so I say 3 at the top. The 2 to the -1 goes to the bottom and becomes positive, but we don't need that 1, so I have 3 over 2. Now let's also address this 1. So this 1 goes away because we move the 2 to the bottom, and we don't need that 1 in front anymore. Now, since I have to graph this, I do need to divide this. So 3 divided by 2 is a 1.5. Okay, now let's graph this point. So I would go over -1. 1.5 is up 1 and then a half. Okay, for the 0, we would have 3 times 2 to the 0. 2 to the 0 is 1, so I'm going to say 3 times 1. 3 times 1 is 3. So 0, 3 is right there. And then lastly, I have a 1. So y equals 3 times 2 to the first power. 2 to the first is just 2. And 3 times 2 is 6. So we have 1, 6. Then we draw our graph. It's not a straight line. It's going to be much of a curve, so I'm going to go ahead and draw it. And as you can see, I get really close to the x-axis, but I don't actually touch it. It's what you call approaching x. We just approach it. We get really close to it. We don't actually get to the x. Don't touch the x. So it's an exponential function. It creates a curve on the graph. All right, let's try this one. So for the next one, again, we're going to use the same three numbers, -1, 0, and 1. So to plug in my -1, I know that f of x is y. So I've got 2 times 4 to the -1. We put it over 1. We make our new fraction with positive exponents. So the 2 stays. The 4 would go down. It's going to be positive exponent now, and we don't need that 1 since the 4 is at the bottom. 4 to the first is just 4. So if I take 2 divided by 4, hopefully you realize that is 1/2 or 0.5. So at -1, I'm going to go up a half. Usually you're going to have a decimal in one of these solutions, usually. Okay, the next one, we got 0. So y equals 2 times 4 to the 0. 4 to the 0 is 1. 2 times 1 is 2. So I'm going to graph 0, 2. Then lastly, I have 2 times 4 to the first. 4 to the first is just 4. And 2 times 4 is 8. So I have 1 to the 8th. Okay, now we graph that curve. And again, we're getting really close to the x-axis, but we actually don't touch it. We just get close to it. So they would just keep going that way forever and ever and ever, and then making that curve there going up. Alright, so for this part, again, example 4, we're going to use -1, 0, 1. F of x is y, and we're going to say y equals 4 times 1/2 to the negative 1 power. Now, if something like this whole fraction is to the negative 1 power, this flips the whole fraction. So, it looks like 4 times, this now becomes 2 over 1. And the 1 right here is invisible, so we don't really need it. And it became positive because we flipped the entire fraction. Now, 2 divided by 1 is just 2. And 4 times 2 is 8. So I'm going to graph negative 1, 8. Then I'm going to plug in the 0. So 4 times 1/2 to the 0 power. Okay, the whole fraction is to the 0 power. So anything to the 0 power we know is 1. So this gives us 4 times 1, which is 4. So I graph 0, 4. Okay, and then lastly, we plug the 1 in, so I have 4 times the 1/2 to the first power. So 1/2 to the first power is just 1/2. Now you can see that I have this whole number 4, but I have a fraction. So I make the 4 a fraction, putting it over 1, and I say 4 times 1 is 4. 1 times 2 is 2. And if I divide those, we get 2. So I would graph 1, 2. The only difference here is that my curve will be going the other direction. Okay, so let's draw the curve here. Again, we're going to get really close to the x-axis, but we actually don't touch it. Alright, and then the last problem of the notes, use our negative 1, 0, 1. We make the f of x a y. We start plugging in. So, for the negative 1, we have 2 times 1/4 to the negative 1 power. Remember that this whole part, this whole fraction is to the negative 1. So you flip it. And 4 divided by 1 is 4. So 2 times 4 is 8. So I'm going to go to negative 1 and then up to 8. Okay, then for the second part, we have 2 times 1/4 to the 0 power. Again, the whole fraction to the 0 power is 1. And 2 times 1 is 2. So I would graph 0, 2. Okay, and then lastly, I say we have 2 times 1/4 to the first power. Okay, if 1/4 to the first power has to be simplified or be evaluated, 1/4 to the first power is just 1/4. But I have to multiply a whole number times a fraction, so the whole number becomes a fraction by putting it over 1, and I multiply across. 2 times 1, 1 times 4, and 2/4 is 1/2, or 0.5 since we're graphing it. So I graph the 1 up half, and then I create that curve again, approaching the x-axis but not actually touching the x-axis. Got a little too close.